Order, and welcome to the public session of the Justice Select Committee this afternoon. Today we're dealing with the pre-appointment hearing for the Chair of the Independent Monitoring Authority for the Citizens' Rights Agreements. I'm delighted that we've got the preferred candidate, Nicole Lappin, to ask some questions of today. Just before I do that and allow you to introduce yourself, Ms. Lappin, just a couple of preliminaries. The first is that Ashley Fox has recused himself from taking part in this hearing on the basis that he was the previous chair of the Independent Monitoring Authority at the IMA, which I think is self-explanatory. We will briefly, as we always do at the beginning of these sessions, give our declarations of interest. I'm a non-practicing barrister. I'm a member of the Unite and GMB trade unions, and I'm a patron of the Hammersmith and Fulham Law Centre and the Upper Room charity.
I'm a practicing barrister, an associate tenant at Number 5 Chambers, and a member of the Honourable Society of the Middle Temple.
Sarah Russell. I am a solicitor with a practicing certificate, actually a member of Inner Temple. I am a member of the Industrial Law Society and a member of the Employment Lawyers Association and Asda and community unions.
Afternoon, I'm Alex Burris-Curtis. I hold a practicing certificate from the SRA as well. I'm a member of the APPG on whistleblowing, and I'm a member of Unite and GMB trade unions.
Tessa Mont, member for Wells and Mendip Hills, and I'm the vice chair, one of the vice chairs on the APPG for whistleblowing and a director of the Whistleblowers UK.
Good afternoon, I'm Warren DeJust. I'm a solicitor and a member of the Executive Council of the GMB Trade Union, and I'm a member of various APPGs.
Good afternoon, I'm Lindsay Farnsworth. I am a non-practicing solicitor formerly of the Crown Prosecution Service, member of a number of unions, including the FDA.
Thank you. Well, welcome again, Ms. Lappin, and if you're happy, we will kick off the questioning. And could I just ask you, therefore, to introduce yourself to the committee and briefly explain your background?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Lappin. I am currently the chair of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, where I have chaired the body for just over 2 years. Cumulatively, I have over 10 years' experience leading 3 public sector organisations in Northern Ireland. In addition to the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, they are the Northern Ireland Ambulance Service, where I was chair for 5 years, and the Charity Commission for Northern Ireland, where I was also the Chief Commissioner for 3 years. I obtained my law degree in Queen's University Belfast, and I qualified as a barrister in King's Inns, Dublin, and for 5 years I practiced between Dublin and Belfast.
Thank you very much. Now, the IMA, well, to give it its full name, the Independent Monitoring Authority for the Citizens' Rights Agreement, but I think we can agree to call it the IMA henceforth, is a public body, but many people will not have heard about it. How would you describe its work to a layperson? Why is it important, and what motivated you to apply for this role?
So I think, Chair, simply put, the IMA was established to ensure that citizens, EU citizens, and those citizens whose rights are recognised under the separation agreement, that they would be maintained, monitored and promoted following EU exit, so that people who had various rights to residence, to work, to study and access public services would continue to have those rights once EU exit took place. I think that is of supreme importance because there are very many people impacted by that. It comes from agreements that were reached with the EU following protracted negotiations. And what attracted me, well, I think it's a fantastic body to exist, to look towards the implementation of citizens' rights that were agreed in the withdrawal agreements and the separation agreements. I was particularly attracted to its remit because it's UK-wide and also obviously covers Gibraltar, and there are, I think, opportunities there for me to play to some of my strengths, hopefully, which are engaging with many different partners.
Very much, Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome. If appointed, Ms Lappin, what professional or voluntary work commitments will you continue to undertake, or might you undertake in the future alongside this role?
So I am 2 years into a 5-year commitment with the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. The commitment there is 2 days a week. I also chair a fitness to practice committee for the Pharmaceutical Society of Northern Ireland. In the past 12 months, that only met on a handful of occasions. I also am a board member of Craigavon Senior High School Board of Governors. Although my second term is coming to an end, I'm told around Easter next year. And I also undertake other ad hoc work on a private capacity when I am available to do so.
So do you think with all of those things you would be able to fulfil the requirements of the IMA role, notwithstanding what you currently have or may have in the future?
Very much so, yes.
Thank you. Moving to the role itself, the essential criteria obviously requires you to lead the board and support the leadership of the IMA by providing guidance and effective challenge. So how does your experience to date demonstrate some of those requirements or capabilities in this area?
So, as I set out just in my introduction, I have experience in leading 3 public sector boards to date, but in addition I've also sat on a number of other boards. So I was an inaugural member of the Education Authority when it was established in Northern Ireland in 2015. I was also for 6 years a independent board member is the title of the Northern Ireland Courts and Tribunals Service, where I also chaired its audit committee for 6 years. And I also have experience of governance from the Republic of Ireland, where I was a non-executive director of the Irish Auditing and Accounting Supervisory Authority, and I sat on its audit committee and chaired it for a year as well. So I bring, I think, a broad brush and hopefully also depth of governance experience from a range of backgrounds to this particular post.
Thank you.
Thank you. The essential criteria requires you to have the ability to gain the confidence and build relationships with quite a range of stakeholders, both in the UK and in Europe, and particularly with ministers and with parliamentarians. Can you explain a little about how you meet that criterion?
So, as I mentioned, this was something that very much attracted me to this role. It is hopefully one of the strengths that I have in that in all the roles that I have performed, I have sought to establish and maintain and develop relationships with a wide range of stakeholders. So perhaps just by way of some assurance for the committee, if I just outline very briefly the work that I'm doing in the Housing Executive with our tenants. The Housing Executive has excellent structures for engaging with tenants through the Housing Community Network and Central Housing Forum. This might be a little cheeky, but just before I came in here, I actually texted the chair of the Central Housing Forum as she was to attend an event this week. She's also one of the independent experts on one of my committees in the Housing Executive. So how I maintain and develop relationships is on a personal basis. If it's not too try to say it, I like people, I like meeting people, I like listening to people, and I like to hear how we can improve services from the stakeholders that we serve, but also how we can work better with those that we work alongside. So whether that's partners in delivering housing services, for example, or with parliamentarians, I meet people whenever that the opportunity arises, and have set in place, particularly with elected representatives and departmental colleagues, opportunities to meet on a regular basis.
Thank you. So as chair, you need the ability to understand and oversee compliance with expenditure controls. And I wondered if you could identify your historic experience with that kind of order of work and demonstrate your capabilities in that particular area.
So in Northern Ireland, the chair wouldn't usually sit on the audit committee, so I bring audit and risk experience from a number of different other organisations. But in the Northern Ireland Ambulance Service, I had looked at the governance structures and realised that we didn't have a specific committee that was scrutinising finance. And I brought in a facilitator who worked with the board members, and collectively we agreed that what we needed was a separate committee to look at resources, both finance and actually people in that particular organisation. And that was to allow for additional time that would not be available in a board meeting to really scrutinise the value for money that the public were getting in terms of the spend in the Northern Ireland Ambulance Service.
So you set up a committee to do that. Did you sit on that committee?
Well, that was interesting because the chair, in my experience, doesn't usually sit as a member of committees because the board, like the Independent Monitoring Authority, was a unitary board. It was a board of 11, so there were 6 non-execs, and that included the chair. I carried a vacancy for quite a long time as well, so there were only 5 non-execs, including myself, available to sit on committees. So I actually did sit as a member of that committee, not as the chair of it, but as a member of it.
Thank you.
I think you've probably already answered this question, but specifically, how do you think that your work experience to date demonstrates the knowledge that you need about citizens' rights?
Oh, no, that's an interesting question because you're asking about knowledge. I think my knowledge about citizens' rights actually began to be formed when I was on the Irish Auditing and Accounting Supervisory Authority. So sitting in the Republic of Ireland, there was a lot of discussion about what the impacts of EU exit would be on the island of Ireland in particular. We would have discussed things like mutual recognition of professional qualifications, something which was very personal to me as well. But also in relation to frontier working. We had that discussion as well in the Northern Ireland Ambulance Service, and obviously within the context of Ireland, the Common Travel Area crystallised that and obviously impacts that in ways that, in a different way to other citizens' rights are implemented. So I think at a very personal level, what I was able to see and take part in discussions really informed my view of the impacts of EU exit. And we were talking about that at a board at a time actually when there wasn't as much talk about the impact on citizens' rights in the more general public arena.
If appointed, do you believe that there are any particular areas where you might need to acquire new skills and knowledge? And if so, how do you think you'll go about acquiring those skills and knowledge?
So I always come from the premise if I think I know everything, it's time to walk away from the roles that I'm doing. I learn all the time. And in particular, this is a role with a very wide remit across a number of different nations. So I absolutely believe that I'm going to have to learn quite fast about perhaps the way things are done and understanding about how relationships work. But I do think I have transferable skills that I can bring to enable me to do that and to come up to speed very quickly.
Thank you. Sarah, did you want to go?
Thank you. Do you see there as being any equalities-specific elements of this role, and what thought have you given to those?
Qualities aspects, I'm not sure I understand. Apologies.
So, in terms of the 9 protected characteristics, do you think that there will be any relationship between this role and those? Do you foresee there being any particularly vulnerable groups whose rights, for instance, you would be particularly looking to advocate for? Do you see there being any differential or any protected characteristics element in this role that you would need to be aware of?
I think from my perspective, and when I was looking at the role and since and going through the process, the way I've looked at that is the hard to reach groups, the individuals who actually need to know that first of all we exist. need to understand that they have rights that are enforceable. I know that the IMA carried out a really interesting and I think useful piece of work in reporting into looked after children, for example, and ensuring that someone was there to support them in making the necessary applications. But I mean, accessibility for me is so much wider. It starts fundamentally with the fact that the citizens' rights and the citizens that we are discussing are unlikely to have English as their first language. So it is reaching them in a way that they can access the services that are there. But also, even more widely, people who are disabled, so people who have a vision impairment, people who have a learning disability, people who may not readily engage with government. So I think there is a challenge there to identify how those groups can be reached so that first of all they are aware of what their rights are, but also then looking to the public bodies to ensure that they are very much aware that individuals have particular rights that must be implemented. Thank you.
Yeah, and Alex.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick follow-up just on the point about the 4 nations, which you've touched on, Ms Lappin. Just in terms of the skills you've got from the wealth of experience you've got before, the ability to sort of bring that to bear, working with obviously the devolved administrations is something that, as a Welsh MP, but also my husband's German, mum's Portuguese, so I'm very conscious of the impact and obviously spread across all of our 4 nations. So just the skills you were referring to before, you feel will naturally feed into your ability to work with the devolved administrations productively and, where necessary, challenge accordingly to get the information and be able to undertake the job that, if appointed, that is required of you under the statute.
Yes, I do, and I think also the recognition that while there are reserved matters, which obviously apply right throughout the United Kingdom, with the devolved nations, and it probably is an area that I'm just reading my way into the brief because obviously it's subject to approval from the committee, but in having a look at the remit, and one area that didn't initially occur to me was that very specific area of legislation making in the devolved nations and the ability of various bodies to make regulations, for example. So taking into account one of the statutory powers that the IMA has in advising on legislation, I'd be quite interested to get my head under the bonnet to see, well, how can the body satisfy itself that it is aware of all of those pieces of legislation when it is tasked with monitoring the implementation of those rights. So I hope that addresses the query.
Yeah, it's just always being conscious of it. It's the same thing we ask of our government, always think about the devolved implications of any policy. So it's a very similar approach. Thank you.
Neil.
Good afternoon. Should you be successful in your appointment, what will your main priorities be? And particularly given that you have already alluded to the large remit of IMA, but it is a relatively small organisation on the same hand, how will you ensure the efficient and effective use of resources to deliver on those priorities?
If I come to the first aspect first, and forgive me, I might come back to you to remind me of the second. So in relation to priorities, well, when I was reading my way into preparation for today and for previous interviews, I obviously looked at documents like the strategic plan from 24-27. That dovetails quite nicely with the term of appointment, should I be appointed. There are 4 very clear strategic objectives in there around ensuring that citizens' rights are promoted and monitored. One that really caught my eye was becoming a trusted organisation. And I would like to explore that further. What does that mean? How can that be measured? Is that trusted by citizens themselves or other bodies, for example, who might represent citizens in various areas? But primarily in that area, I think, and this is at a very preliminary stage, Chair, thinking about public bodies. Is the IMA seen to be a trusted body that they can go to for advice and information regarding how they ensure that they comply with citizens' rights? In relation to your second question, would you repeat that, please?
Yes, I was saying, given that you have a relatively large remit for IMA, but it's a relatively small organisation, how will you use your resources efficiently and effectively in order to deliver upon your priorities?
So I've had the opportunity to have a few preliminary conversations with the Chief Executive, and actually last week I met with the Interim Chair. Should the committee approve my appointment, one of the earliest things I would be doing is sitting down with the Chief Executive to do a little bit of stakeholder mapping. So to identify those people that the IMA really needs to engage with as a matter of a priority, and to discuss how, between the Chief Executive and Chair's role, that can be managed most effectively. In terms of its efficiency and its effectiveness, I'm aware, and only aware at a very high level, that the MOJ recently carried out a review of the body and determined that it was operating effectively and efficiently. That is something which, if I'm appointed as chair, I would want the board and its committees to continue to do. Now, I think for me, I would want to understand what the metrics are for that, to have assurance that we were looking at the right things. The body's been in place almost 4 years, so there is a good baseline there to begin to assess how it is going forward with its effectiveness and how it is doing that in the most efficient manner.
And in your earlier answer, you talked about how you would like the IMA to be perceived by the public. How do you think it's currently perceived in terms of its profile and reputation?
So in terms of its profile, first of all, the day before my first interview, I was meeting with some of our tenants, one of our tenants groups, and I happened to be sitting beside an individual who is from the European Union and who had lived in Northern Ireland for about 15 years. And we were just chatting, and she happened to mention a few issues that she'd had, and I asked her, have you ever heard of the Independent Monitoring Authority? And she hadn't. So I know it's a straw poll of one, but that was quite an interesting insight. I have heard that concerns have been raised by various people about whether the IMA has the right profile, whether it is delivering what other people might have expectations for it. And I think one of the jobs for the chair and the board will be to ensure that those expectations are managed, so people are very clear about what the IMA is there to do, and then for the chair and the board to ensure that the IMA does what it is mandated to do under the statute.
Thank you. And looking to the future, what challenges do you think the IMA will face over your tenure? And how would you continue to use the IMA's powers to respond to those challenges?
So I'm thinking about the strategic objectives that the IMA has currently in its 24-27 strategy. And I think we've touched on this throughout this evidence in relation to its remit. It is a huge remit. You mentioned yourself; it's a fairly small body with this huge remit. So it is ensuring that its presence is actually known. I understand from the Chief Executive she is encouraged by the fact that courts are now looking to the IMA to intervene in proceedings whenever there is an interpretation of the withdrawal agreements. But also I understand it has been successful in assisting with the formulation of legislation. And I think that is an area that it may well want to just focus on, not to the exclusion of everything else, but certainly a very important area to get upstream, if you like, so that when legislation is put in place, it is the right legislation going forward that will be implemented. But you did ask me about challenges. I think it's in its remit and ensuring that with... perhaps you've referred to it as a small body. I think it has around 60 staff and a modest budget compared to many other organisations. Has it got the capacity to sit with all of the bodies that are impacted as a result of the withdrawal agreement and the separation agreement?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I want to turn to just a couple of questions on the work that's undertaken by the IMA. So the first is, to what extent do you think the IMA has the powers, and kind of follows on from your questioning with Neil, to what extent does the IMA have the powers and duties it needs in order to carry out its role effectively?
I think that depends on what sort of body the IMA is. Looking at it, and apologies, I'm looking at it still from the outside, But in speaking with the Chief Executive, and I had the opportunity to have a couple of conversations with her, I certainly, and this would be borne out by some of the roles I've also had, I see the IMA as being most successful when it enables bodies to understand and recognise what citizens' rights are there and how they must be implemented and upheld. So when I was looking at the powers, it actually has quite a few statutory powers. Some of them are quite, and I've been thinking of the way of describing this. The best word I can use is draconian, and my view is that statutory power should only be used as a measure of last resort. Where it is much more effective is if you can get cooperation with your other public bodies, for example, to come alongside them and to, through, I think there is a power that the IMA has where bodies have to provide information to the IMA, but to come alongside them and to encourage them by ensuring that they have the right policies and procedures in place, and it is building up a body of expertise to do that very successfully.
Thank you. And from the kind of portfolio of work that the IMA currently does, what, from those conversations and your learning at the moment, do you think it's doing particularly well?
So just from the conversations, and I can go no further than that at this point, I've touched on its role in providing that advice on legislation. I understand that in many cases it is being consulted with in terms of sharing its expertise and its insight as legislation is being formulated. I think that's actually really powerful and very impactful in a positive way. And I think then also looking at, and apologies, this is a phrase I heard actually when I was speaking to the Chief Executive just yesterday. We had a phone call and she was looking at the future generations, people and children in particular, who are within families, how their rights will be recognised and upheld going forward in the future. So that's medium to long-term impacts of the withdrawal from the EU.
Of course, associated with that, in terms of the kind of understanding of rights, the assertion of rights, are the fact that the IMA can also receive complaints, because where it's gone wrong and complaints are made. What role do you think the IMA should play in hearing the complaints of citizens, and how should it respond to those individuals who've sent in the complaints?
So for me, that's a really interesting question. That was probably where I started whenever I was thinking of applying, was looking at the complaints and understanding that there was a view that the IMA would be receiving tens of thousands of complaints. In fact, I think last year it was around 500 complaints that it received. And I think you ask a really interesting question. From my perspective, and I feel I am reaching here at this point, just because I haven't got the experience of actually being in the organisation, there are statutory powers available which have been used, and we know that there is one JR, judicial review, that took place. But actually it's, I think, more, and this is referred to in some of the documentation I was reading, gathering that information as to where there may be systemic issues and raising awareness of where those are. And then there may be other people who will take forward action in relation to some of those things where it's necessary. The IMA does have those statutory powers that I've mentioned to use when it's appropriate. But I'm not sure that it should be too quick to do that. It has a role which I think it's performing really well in coming alongside public bodies right across the United Kingdom and Gibraltar to raise awareness and then to identify where there may be issues and to see where that can be taken forward either by the IMA or by others.
That's really helpful. And so sort of building on that in terms of the citizens that may come forward, sort of what specific challenges do you feel or think the EU and EEA, after citizens in the nations, home nations face, and how can the IMA support those rights? Because as you said, it's not necessarily clicking the red button as such with the kind of ultimate statutory action, but what other actions could the IMA take under your leadership if appointed?
So I think it is along those, I don't know if the right word to use is softer powers to have reports and investigations if those are necessary, to provide advice when legislation is being developed. I've already referred to that. And you were mentioning the sorts of complaints that might be brought forward. I think the main focus has been on ensuring people have their settled status, and we know that there are around 3 million people who are still waiting on their application being processed. I'm not sure that was envisaged whenever the IMA was being considered, but that's the first hurdle. After that, then I think we will wait to see how individuals encounter issues and how we can ensure that they are supported in dealing with those issues.
You very neatly segue to the question I was going to ask about the kind of settlement scheme status, because obviously that closed for the applications in June 21, but you've referred to the significant problems. So what role do you think the IMA can take in this area to sort of assist in dealing with that problem, which, as you say, was most likely not intended at the time this was all constructed?
I think it goes back to its two main statutory duties, and that is to monitor and promote, and particularly monitor, to ensure that people do get the right to residency and ensure that they have a successful outcome to their applications.
Mm-hmm. And then, just finally, before I'll pass back to the Chair, in terms of the relationship the IMA has with the Home Office and other relevant government departments, obviously that a good, productive relationship, and frankly as well with the devolved administrations, notwithstanding the reserved element, good relationships are obviously essential to achieve positive outcomes, which is the purpose here. So what would you do to develop, maintain those sort of functional, productive and positive working relationships with these key stakeholders, government departments and devolved administrations?
So wherever there is an opportunity to meet with them, and sometimes that will be on a one-to-one basis or perhaps with the Chief Executive as well. But what I also do in my current role and what I've done in other roles is where there are opportunities to attend conferences, and sometimes I've been invited to speak at those conferences. But actually for me it's been a lot about listening to other people. So sometimes I think we can approach people with various assumptions about where they are coming from. Sometimes to hear what their difficulties and challenges are really useful in identifying the best way forward for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I just have a few questions on your independence and possible conflicts of interest. How will you ensure that you remain independent of government?
I think that's so important, particularly with this body, and that is to ensure as chair, along with the board, that the body remains focused on its statutory duties and that any action it takes is in furtherance of those statutory duties.
Do you have any conflicts of interest that we should know about, or have you thought about whether there'll be any conflicts of interest emerging in the future?
So in relation to conflicts of interest, there are no conflicts that can't be managed, Chair. So I would have, obviously I've indicated I am the Chair of the Housing Executive. It's a public body, and should the IMA ever have an issue with any of the actions being taken or not taken by the Housing Executive, I would not be involved in any discussions or have any awareness of that. I would simply recuse myself from that. That would be the same with the Pharmaceutical Society of Northern Ireland, and I have no difficulty doing that. I did it in other roles as well.
So you can see, if something emerges in the future, you can see a procedure for dealing with that?
Absolutely. Yes, there's the interim chair is the deputy chair, and I would be very happy to ensure that somebody else led on those issues, and I wasn't party to any of the discussions at all.
Have you undertaken any political activity in the last 5 years for either for a political party, being a candidate, donating sums of money?
No.
Do you have any intention of taking up any political activity while you're in this position, if you're appointed?
No.
It's clear, thank you. In that case, just a couple of concluding questions. How will you judge at the end of your tenure whether it's been a success?
So I have been thinking about that. The big answer is that if the IMA has been successful, there will not be a need for the IMA. Whether that would happen within 3 years, I think it lies elsewhere. Other people will make that determination. For me as chair, if I was appointed, then I would be looking to the strategic plan that exists and how well the body has delivered on becoming a trusted partner with various stakeholders, how it has ensured that citizens' rights have been promoted and monitored.
Well, thank you. You've answered our question, I think, very clearly. Are there any other matters concerning your candidature or your priorities which you don't think that we've covered and which you would like to comment on?
No, thank you.
Well, in that case, thank you very much for attending. We will close the public session now and then ask you to retire so we can consider what report we then make. So I will now close the public session of the committee. Order.